Congratulations, you've done it. We're at the end. So now for something completely different than what you just heard, I want to wrap up with something that's kind of heavy and significant and serious. I'm going to talk about restorative justice, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of race and reinvestment and where we are going in our justice and education systems. In order to do that, first I want to let you know a little bit about who I am, but I'm going to do that in a really quick and easy way because I can't really tell you all about that. That's me. And I want you to listen to this conversation and consider that you may find yourself in one of three places. You may listen with a sense of interested detachment. This is nice, this is good information, doesn't really apply to me, but I'm glad I know it. You may listen from a place of finding yourself located somewhere in it. This has happened to me, this has happened to somebody I know, I can relate to this. Or lastly, you may, by the end of this talk, find yourself in a place that says, wow, that was really interesting. I'm fired up, I'm engaged, and I'm called to action. That's the one I'm aiming for. That said, there's a lot of words in here. There's too many words, and I know that. But some of you engage auditorily, some of you hear what I say, and some of you are visual learners. And I'm going to give it to you both ways in hopes that somewhere along this you find that space of activism that motivates you. So I've been studying restorative. I've been in the justice system involved in some way or another for about 30 years now. I know I don't look that old. I've been studying and practicing and teaching and training and everything around restorative justice for nearly 20 years now. But last year something happened. Last year I went to a conference that was specifically focused on restorative justice and race. And I heard Angela Davis speak. Some of you may know who Angela Davis is. She was a political racial activist in the 1960s. I listened to a man named Ted Wise speak, who is a racial justice advocate who speaks about the concept of white privilege, something embarrassingly I had not yet considered for myself before. And following that, I read a book by a woman named Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, where she talks about the crisis of mass incarceration resulting in an era of Jim Crow that is not so dissimilar from that we faced following the Civil War and slavery. So what does this mean to me, I ask myself? And what can it mean to you in the context of this conversation? And what does it mean to where we are headed? And this is where I hope we will find ourselves as we move forward. So the point here is that there are really complex relationships between race and justice and rights. That justice and education is experienced very differently by people of color in this country. And that restorative justice has the possibility of alleviating racial disparity and reallocating justice resources in a completely different way than we do now. So we're all good academics. We're at FAU. I teach at FAU. We have to talk about theory. And in theory, there's something called criminology. Critical criminology says it's not by accident the way the law has been designed, and it protects certain people's rights, particularly rich white men, more than it protects the rights and privileges of others. And in so doing, it deludes these others into thinking that the law is actually operating in their benefit, that we are actually doing it to protect their interests, or doing it in a way that provides some opportunity for their economic well-being. And so the poor are not really breaking the rules any more often than anybody else. But because they live their lives in a particular way, they get caught more often because they're more visible on the streets. Their lives are more expendable because we don't care that much. And we use them to deter others. And they fuel the economy as their role as inputs into the criminal justice machine, and we need their obedience in order to make this happen. So added to that, we've got something called critical race theory. Critical race theory says that the law reflects this particular perspective, and that we do this in something called negative racialization of others who don't really belong. That these others are not entitled to the same protection of law as we are. As white people in this particular culture. And there's a way we do that, and we do it through incarceration, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But critical race theory says that racial exclusion is not accidental, but it's the result of a particular liberal political philosophy that requires an other. If there is somebody other than that, us, then there is somebody for whose rights we fight. There is somebody different from us. And what it does is it preserves an us and them. It preserves a difference between who we are and who they are. Then there's The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And she says that it's not by accident that we have incarcerated such an enormous, disproportionate percentage of our African American population, such that we now have more people under correctional supervision than were enslaved in 1850. The series of laws that has occurred since the end of the Civil War and slavery has continued to criminalize certain behaviors that are located in particular populations. And that this, again, is not by accident. So what does this look like? Well, it means that you can't get certain jobs. That's not so different from Jim Crow. What we do it, though, is that now we don't say it's because you're black. We say it's because you've been incarcerated. You can't. You don't have the same access to education that some white citizens have, in part because you can't get loans, because you're now labeled a felon. You can't get into certain public housing. You're excluded from places to live, and you are excluded from voting and exercising your civil rights in this society where how we vote is one of our basic primary rights. So what's the evidence? Let's be clear here that I'm not simply telling you a story, but there's evidence for this. If we look at the percent of people who live in poverty, and if we look particularly at the percent of children who live in poverty, the majority of these are minority and often black citizens. I know I'm going very quickly. If we look at who's graduating from high school, the graduation rates are consistently lowest among our African American citizens. And if we look at who's employed, who is most consistently unemployed and most persistently unemployed, again, resides among our African American populations. If we look at who's in the workforce, we can see that people of color make up nearly 1/3 of the workforce, but where are they represented at the top echelons of those businesses? Not at the top. It starts in schools, where this kid, yes, he's my son, and this kid happen to have very different experiences. If you look at who is getting suspended and expelled in schools, the kids who are getting suspended and expelled and subject to disciplinary referral for the most subjective and arbitrary offenses tend to be kids of color. If you look here at who is most likely to get suspended here by race and gender, it's black males. This is not dissimilar who's from winding up in our incarcerative systems. What's going on in the justice system? Well, here, I don't know if you know this, but crime rates are going down. Incarceration rates, however, are going in the opposite direction. They're going up. And who do you think is mostly responsible for this? Not responsible, is mostly caught up in this web? Let's look a little more closely at when this starts to happen. Right here, 1980. You know what happened in 1980? Any ideas? The war on drugs. Exactly. The war on drugs has resulted in over 1.5 million people in prison as of 2012. And when you add to that the population in jails, we've got almost 2.5 million people incarcerated in this country. Most of that is for drug offenses, and of those drug offenses, 2/3 of it is for marijuana. So who's getting arrested for marijuana? Well, marijuana use by race is about even among the races, maybe a little higher among the black population, although if you look over the lifetime course, it is probably even lower among blacks. Here, percent never used. But look who's getting arrested. I want your jaw to drop, and I want you to be disgusted and appalled at this, because it's hideous. The likelihood of being incarcerated, while only about 1 in 111 for white women, a little less for white men, for black men, 1 in 3. 1 in 3 black men in this room is likely to spend time in prison. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country. 1 in 100 adults are incarcerated. And if you're white, your chances are a little bit better. If you're Hispanic, it gets worse. If you're African American, your chances are 1 in 15 of being incarcerated. If you are under between the ages of 20 and 34, and you are African American, your chances are 1 in 9 you're going to wind up in prison. Yeah, that's bad. Blacks are more likely to get incarcerated at 6 times the rates of whites. And it is all because of the war on drugs that starts disproportionately among youth. Disproportionate minority contact means you get caught up in these systems disproportionate to your percentage in the population or the percentage of white peers. Blacks are more likely to get caught up in this disproportionate to their rates in the population or to the rates among their white peers. So here, juveniles get arrested at about twice the rates of whites if you are black, etc. I'm running out of time. I'm not going to do all of these, but you can see it. The numbers are not good. So bottom line, what's restorative justice and what does it have to offer? Well, restorative justice says that crime is harm and that justice can be healing. That crime is about breaks in relationships and that what we need to do is to reconnect people in relationship. The way that we do that in restorative justice is we say crime is a violation of people and relationships. Violations create obligations, and the central obligation is to put right the harm. Makes sense, right? It's not rocket science. In the traditional system, we say what laws were broken, whose fault is it, and who do we punish? And in a system like that, the way we handle crime and misbehavior is not to teach respect and dignity. It's not to shower people with love and respect. It's not to offer compassion. It's to teach people a lesson. In restorative justice, we say it a little differently. In restorative justice, we say who's been hurt and what harm was done, what are their needs, and who is responsible to make it right. So in a system that looks like this, we say that crime is a violation of individuals, relationships, and communities. Justice is about repairing the harm, and to the greatest extent possible, the way we do this is by rebuilding relationships that have been broken by crime and other conflicts. So in this context, the way we respond to crime is by bringing victims, offenders, communities together to talk about what happened, what needs to be done to repair it, and we do this through dialogue, through listening, and through sharing, accountability, and building empathy. Well, there's evidence that this works. I'm not simply telling you a story so that we can all think, isn't this nice, and let's sing Kumbaya and hug a tree. But there's actually a lot of evidence that this works. In schools, all of these states are practicing restorative justice in one form or another. It may not be in every district or in every school, but somewhere restorative justice is happening in at least 40% of U.S. states. And here are some of the results. Suspensions go down, expulsions go down, police tickets go down, violent and serious acts go down in all of these places, supported by the research I'm pointing to here. The point here is that the arrows consistently go down. Restorative justice is working to keep kids in school rather than pushing them out and excluding them. In juvenile and criminal justice, we see recidivism rates going down. We see post-traumatic stress disorder among victims going down. We see greater satisfaction with the justice experience. We see decreased needs for revenge, increased suspension, decreased likelihood of reoffending. We see that it does not increase the possibility of reoffending or recidivism when compared to traditional strategies. In fact, it tends to reduce recidivism more among violent offenders even than among non-violent offenders, which most people would think was counterintuitive. Restorative justice has been shown to reduce reoffending equal to or better than traditional criminal justice systems. But the problem is that persons of color are not equally being offered restorative justice alternatives as are their white peers. So to sum up, I want to leave you with the idea that racial justice exists in both justice and education systems. And there's theory that says that this is not accidental, that this is actually a system that we have intentionally designed to serve certain purposes to keep some people in power and other people out of power. But restorative justice can produce positive outcomes in schools, in juvenile justice, and in criminal justice by reducing the outcomes that make lives worse break relationships and destroy empathy. It can actually decrease disproportionate minority contact in both education and justice systems, and it may be more socially and cost-effective than any of the punitive justice strategies we are now dumping millions and millions and millions of dollars into. And so to conclude, what I leave you with is the idea, which I believe is that true justice cannot really exist without considering social and racial justice. Restorative justice is one of the best strategies that we have for accomplishing this. And what Aristotle said is that perhaps injustice is a broad concept that can only be addressed by each of our individual acts to build the world as a more better and more tolerant place. So in sum, if you want peace, work for justice. And I leave you with one of my favorite quotes from a pronounced racial and justice advocate, Cornel West, who says that never forget that love is what justice looks like in public. Thank you.